On March 4, 1944, Captain Don Gentile soared 28,000 feet above Berlin. His fuel gauge read dangerously low. Having escorted B-17 bombers from England deep into Nazi Germany, his P-51 Mustang was now in a perilous situation. This marked the deepest penetration into German airspace, a record at 600 miles. Every pilot in his squadron was equally anxious, watching their fuel gauges drop with mounting dread. They had enough fuel to reach Berlin, but not enough to make it back. According to every calculation, every engineering manual, and every official Army Air Force guideline, this mission should have been impossible. 6 months earlier, it had been impossible. American bombers were being decimated over Germany without fighter escort. B-17s and B-24s were falling from the skies at catastrophic rates, some missions losing over 20% of aircraft. Without protection, entire bomber groups were being destroyed. The P-47s and P-51s, the fighters capable of providing protection, barely had enough fuel to make it to the German border before turning back. Their internal fuel tanks just didn't hold enough for the round trip. The solution didn't come from engineers at Wright Field, aircraft designers at North American Aviation, or strategic planners at 8th Air Force headquarters. It came from a motor pool mechanic who asked a question that no one else thought to ask. What if we strapped more fuel tanks to the outside? This idea seemed absurd, dangerous, impractical, and against all principles of aerodynamic design. The Army Air Force had already rejected external fuel tanks as unsafe. But one stubborn mechanic refused to accept that rejection. He built the first crude external fuel tank in a maintenance hangar, using salvaged parts and sheer determination. Thanks to this mechanic's invention, Captain Gentile was alive above Berlin, and the future of American fighters would change. Sometimes, the craziest ideas are the ones that change history. This is the story of how a mechanic's garage-built solution doubled the range of American fighters and won the air war over Europe. The slaughter had begun on October 14, 1943, at Schweinfurt, Germany, during a mission that would become known as Black Thursday. The target was Germany's ball-bearing production facilities, a strategically sound move to cripple German war production. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from England that morning, flying deep into Germany without fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts could only accompany them to the edge of Germany before having to turn back due to fuel limitations. What happened next shocked even the most battle-hardened bomber crews. Freed from the threat of American escorts, German fighters attacked in waves. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came from every angle, above, below, and head-on. They focused on individual bombers, continuing the attack until they were shot down. The mathematics of destruction were brutal. 60 B-17s were lost, over 600 American airmen were killed or captured, and another 17 bombers were so badly damaged they never flew again. The loss rate was 26%, catastrophic and unsustainable. If this continued, the entire 8th Air Force's bomber fleet would be wiped out within months. Lieutenant Colonel Burnley, who flew as an observer during that mission, wrote in his report, "They came in from 12 o'clock level, firing as they closed. When they passed, more fighters attacked from 6 o'clock. We were helpless. I watched B-17s explode, break apart and spin down, trailing fire. I counted 23 parachutes. Over 100 men didn't make it out. The Schweinfurt raid forced a brutal reckoning. Long-range bomber missions without fighter escorts was suicide, but fighters didn't have the range to protect bombers deep into Germany. The Air Force faced an impossible choice: stop strategic bombing, conceding the air war to Germany, or keep losing bombers at unsustainable rates. At 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, England, staff officers calculated the numbers. If loss rates continued at 20–25%, they would run out of bombers before Germany ran out of fighters. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, sent an urgent cable to Washington. Without long-range fighter escort, the strategic bombing campaign cannot continue. We require an immediate solution to the fighter range limitation. The current situation is untenable. The solution everyone wanted was simple: build fighters with longer range. But that wasn't simple at all. In November 1943, the Army Air Force's top aeronautical engineers gathered in Wright Field, Ohio, to solve the range problem. They faced a fundamental issue. Aircraft range depended on a simple equation: fuel capacity divided by fuel consumption. To double the range, they needed either to double the fuel capacity or reduce fuel consumption. The P-51 Mustang already had an efficient Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, one of the most fuel-efficient engines ever built. You couldn't improve it much more. That left fuel capacity. The Mustang's internal tanks held 269 gallons, which at a cruise consumption of 65 gallons per hour gave roughly 4 hours of flight time. But to reach Berlin and return, the Mustang needed at least 6 hours of flight time. That meant carrying an additional 131 gallons of fuel, something no one thought possible. The additional 131 gallons of fuel weighed over 800 pounds, making it clear that adding such a load internally was impossible. The P-51 structure couldn't handle the weight, and the shift in center of gravity would be dangerously unstable. The added weight would also reduce the aircraft's performance unacceptably. The engineers' consensus was clear: it couldn't be done. Briefly, they discussed external fuel tanks, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. Colonel Donald Putt, the Director of Research and Development, stated the official position: external tanks create excessive drag, reducing speed and maneuverability. They're vulnerable to enemy fire and compromise the aircraft's structural integrity. They're simply not practical for combat operations. With that, the meeting ended without a solution. The engineers believed that physics had effectively ruled out the possibility of fighters escorting bombers to Berlin. But in England, a motor pool mechanic was about to prove them wrong. The crazy mechanic, November 22nd, 1943's Bodiam Airfield, England. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey wasn't supposed to be solving strategic problems. His job was to maintain P-51 Mustangs for the 354th Fighter Group, changing oil, replacing spark plugs, and patching bullet holes. However, Kelsey had a habit of asking questions that annoyed his superiors. Why can't fighters carry more fuel? Why must they turn back at the German border? Why are bomber crews dying because fighters run out of fuel? The official answer was always the same: it's an engineering problem. The experts are working on it. Do your job, Sergeant. Kelsey did his job, but in his spare time, he worked on something else. In a maintenance hangar after hours, using scrap materials and borrowed tools, Kelsey started building. He wasn't an engineer and didn't have formal aerodynamics training, but he had an idea that seemed obvious to him. If the plane can't carry more fuel inside, why not put it outside? Kelsey took a 75-gallon auxiliary fuel tank from a damaged P-47, a tank designed to fit inside the fuselage, and modified it to hang externally under the wing. His modifications were crude: welded metal brackets, repurposed fuel lines, and a simple mechanical release to let the pilot jettison the tank when empty or in combat. His squadron commander, Major James Howard, discovered Kelsey's project by accident. "What the hell are you doing, Sergeant?" he asked. Kelsey explained, "If we hang this tank under the wing, the pilot gets an extra 75 gallons, maybe an extra hour and a half of flight time, enough to go deeper into Germany." Howard's response was immediate. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You can't just bolt a fuel tank to a fighter's wing. Have you considered the aerodynamics, the structural stress? What happens if it ruptures in flight?" Kelsey didn't have answers to those questions. He just knew it might work. Howard should have ordered him to stop, but instead he said something that would change the war. "Let's test it." The first test, November 28, 1943, Bodiam Airfield. Captain Jack Ilfrey volunteered to fly the test. Actually, volunteered wasn't quite accurate. When Howard asked who wanted to fly a Mustang with an untested crude fuel tank bolted to its wing, every other pilot suddenly found urgent maintenance tasks. But Ilfrey didn't hesitate. He looked at Kelsey's contraption and shrugged. If it falls off, I'll jettison it. If it blows up, well, we die in combat anyway. Let's see if this thing works." The ground crew filled the external tank with 75 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. The tank, looking like an afterthought, was bolted beneath the port wing. Ilfrey's pre-flight inspection was thorough, checking every bolt, connection and weld. He climbed into the cockpit, started the Merlin engine, and taxied to the runway. The takeoff was normal, and the tank stayed attached. So far, so good. Ilfrey climbed to 10,000 feet and began testing. How did the tank affect handling? He performed gentle turns, steep turns, and rolls. The Mustang handled differently due to the asymmetric load, but it remained controllable. How is fuel flow? He switched to the external tank, and the engine ran smoothly. The critical test was the release mechanism. Ilfrey pulled the emergency jettison handle. The tank detached cleanly and tumbled toward the English countryside below. Ilfrey brought the Mustang back and landed. His report was short and to the point. It works. The tank stayed on during maneuvers. The fuel flowed properly. It released when I pulled the handle. It actually works. Major Howard immediately recognized the implications. If a 75-gallon external tank gave an extra 90 minutes of flight time, what about bigger tanks? What if they installed tanks on both wings? He sent an urgent message to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Successfully tested external fuel tank installation on P-51. Results positive. Request authorization for expanded testing and operational deployment. The response was swift and negative. External fuel tank concept previously evaluated and rejected. Modifications to aircraft unauthorized. Cease testing immediately. Howard read the message, crumpled it up, and turned to Kelsey. Build more tanks. We're going to need them. The bureaucratic battle, December 1943. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe. When General Ira Eaker learned that a fighter squadron was conducting unauthorized modifications, his first instinct was to order court-martials. Major Howard was summoned to headquarters to explain why he had ignored orders to cease testing. Howard's defense was simple. With respect, sir, we're losing bombers because fighters can't escort them. This invention solves that problem. Every day that the external fuel tanks weren't used, more bomber crews died. General Ecker's chief of staff, Brigadier General Frederick Castle, was less diplomatic. You're a squadron commander, not an engineer. Wright Field has the best aeronautical engineers in the world. If external tanks worked, they would have designed them. Howard pulled out Ilfrey's test flight report, along with detailed specifications for Kelsey's design. He presented fuel consumption calculations, range extensions, and the potential operational impact. The staff officers remained unmoved. The design hadn't been tested for structural integrity, nor had it been evaluated for aerodynamic efficiency. It hadn't gone through the proper channels. General Ecker listened to the argument and then asked one simple question. How much range does it add? Howard consulted his notes. A 75-gallon tank adds approximately 90 minutes of flight time, enough to escort bombers another 150 miles deeper into Germany. Ecker quickly did the mental math. Fighter escorts currently ended at the German border. Adding 150 miles would cover bombers to the Ruhr industrial area, perhaps even as far as Frankfurt. What about larger tanks? Ecker asked. Howard had already anticipated this question. If we scale up to 150-gallon tanks, we could potentially reach Berlin and return. The room fell silent. Berlin was the target everyone had dreamed of striking. It was the heart of Nazi Germany, but it was 600 miles from England, unreachable with the current fighter escorts. Ecker made his decision. Overrule Wright Field's objections. Authorize immediate production of external fuel tanks. I want a squadron equipped and operational within 30 days, Castle protested. Sir, Wright Field should properly evaluate the design first. Ecker cut him off. Wright Field has had months to solve this problem. They failed. A motor pool sergeant solved it in 3 weeks with scrap metal. Get these tanks into production now. The rush to production, January 1944. North American Aviation, Inglewood, California. When North American Aviation received emergency orders to manufacture external fuel tanks for the P-51, Their engineering team was skeptical. Chief designer Edgar Schmood examined Kelsey's crude prototype that had been shipped from England. "This is your design?" he asked, looking at the welded scrap metal and improvised brackets. The Army Air Force liaison, Colonel Mark Bradley, was blunt. "This is what works. Your job is to make it manufacturable at scale." Schmood's team spent 72 hours reverse engineering Kelsey's design. They refined the aerodynamics, strengthened the attachment points, and streamlined the production methods. The final design used pressed aluminum construction, a streamlined teardrop shape, standardized mounting brackets, and the mechanical release mechanism proven in testing. Tanks were made in 75-gallon, 108-gallon, and 150-gallon versions. Production began immediately, operating 3 shifts 7 days per week. The first production tanks rolled off the assembly line on January 15th. By the end of the month, North American was producing 200 tanks per day. Simultaneously, modification kits were made to retrofit existing P-51s to attach the external fuel tanks. Every Mustang in England would be modified, but production was only half the battle. The tanks had to be filled, transported, and attached to the fighters. Logistics proved challenging. External tanks were shipped to England by cargo vessel and bomber bases, then stored in dedicated facilities. Before each mission, ground crews had to attach the tanks, fill them with fuel, and ensure proper connections to the aircraft's fuel system. This process added 30 minutes to pre-flight preparation, but those 30 minutes added 3 hours of flight time. The first combat mission, January 21st, 1944, Debden Airfield, England. The 354th Fighter Group was selected for the first operational mission using external fuel tanks. The target was Frankfurt, 280 miles from England, beyond the previous maximum range for fighter escorts. 48 P-51s, each carrying a 108-gallon external tank, prepared for takeoff. The pilots had mixed feelings about the new equipment. Captain Dwayne Barn voiced what many were thinking. "We're going into combat with giant bombs strapped to our wings. If a German fighter hits these tanks, we're flying gasoline bombs." The briefing officer addressed the concern. "The tanks are self-sealing, just like your internal tanks. If hit, they'll leak, but they won't explode. And you can jettison them anytime." The mission briefing was straightforward. Escort the bombers to Frankfurt, engage any German fighters, and return to base. What wasn't said but was clearly understood was that if the external tanks failed, if they didn't provide the promised range, the fighters would run out of fuel over Germany. The pilots would have to choose between bailing out over enemy territory or attempting a crash landing. This mission would either validate Sergeant Kelsey's crazy idea or prove that the right field engineers were right to reject it. At 0830 hours, the formation of 48 Mustangs took off. Each aircraft now carried over 400 gallons of fuel, enough theoretically to fly to Frankfurt and back. As they crossed the English Channel, several pilots reported handling differences due to the external tanks. The Mustang was slightly less maneuverable and slightly slower, but it was manageable. They rendezvoused with the bombers, and the mission was underway. The bomber stream flew over Belgium, with 17 flying fortresses in tight formation heading toward Frankfurt. At the German border, where fighters usually turned back, the P-51s pushed forward. For the first time, American fighters were deep within German airspace. The Luftwaffe's response showed they hadn't expected this. German fighter controllers, monitoring the inbound bomber stream, had positioned their fighters beyond the anticipated range of American escorts. When P-51s appeared over Frankfurt, the German pilots were caught completely off guard. The combat was brief but decisive. The 354th Fighter Group claimed 11 German fighters destroyed, with no American losses. However, the real victory was psychological. For the first time, American fighters had escorted bombers to a major German industrial target and returned. The external tanks had worked. Captain Bond landed at Debden with fuel to spare. His post-mission report was enthusiastic. The tanks performed flawlessly. We jettisoned them before engaging German fighters. The Mustang handled normally after release. This changes everything. And it did. It changed everything. The strategic shift, February 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters. The success of the Frankfurt mission triggered an immediate operational shift. General James Doolittle, who had replaced Ecker as 8th Air Force commander, ordered the rapid expansion of external tank use. Every fighter group would be equipped, and every mission would use them. The goal was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe by forcing them to fight under conditions where American fighters had the advantage. External tanks enabled a revolutionary tactic. Fighters would escort bombers to the target, then break off to attack German airfields. They now had enough fuel to hunt, engage, and return to England. German fighter pilots, accustomed to attacking bombers without interference, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. The first major test came during Big Week, from February 20th to 25, 1944. The 8th Air Force launched massive raids against German aircraft production facilities. The numbers were staggering: 3,800 bomber sorties, 3,700 fighter sorties, with nearly all fighters equipped with external tanks. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, but American fighters with extended range were everywhere, over targets, German airfields, and along flight paths. In 1 week, German fighter losses exceeded 250 aircraft. More critically, the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots it couldn't replace. Major Johannes Steinhoff, a German ace with over 100 victories, described the shock in his post-war memoir. "We expected American fighters to turn back at the border, as always. Instead, they stayed with the bombers all the way to the target. Then they came after us. They had the fuel to hunt us. We were no longer hunters. We had become the hunted. The external fuel tanks had fundamentally changed the air war's dynamics. German fighters could no longer attack bombers with impunity. American fighters could now engage anywhere over Germany, Berlin, or bust at March 4th, 1944. Debden Airfield. The mission everyone had been waiting for. The target, Berlin, 630 miles from England. This was the deepest fighter escort mission ever attempted. 64 P-51s from the 354th and 357th Fighter Groups would escort bombers to the German capital. Each Mustang carried 2 external tanks, 150 gallons under each wing. This gave each fighter a total of 570 gallons, enough for the round trip barely. Captain Don Gentile, already an ace with 10 victories, was selected as flight leader. He understood the mission's significance. If we can escort bombers to Berlin and back, no target in Germany is safe. We win the air war. The pre-mission briefing emphasized fuel management. Every gallon mattered. Pilots were instructed to maintain precise cruise speed, optimal altitude, and minimal combat maneuvering. The briefing officer was blunt. If you get into an extended dogfight, you won't have enough fuel to reach England. Choose your battles carefully. The mission launched at 8 Ussur hours. The weather was poor but flyable. As they crossed the Dutch coast, several pilots reported concerns about fuel consumption. Captain Gentile monitored his gauges obsessively. The Merlin engine was consuming fuel as calculated, and the external tanks were feeding properly. Everything was working over northern Germany. They rendezvoused with the bomber stream, 328 B-17 flying fortresses heading toward Berlin. The German response was fierce. Luftwaffe fighters concentrated to defend the capital, attacking in waves. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and even new jet-powered Messerschmitt 262s joined the fray. The American fighters jettisoned their external tanks and engaged. The dogfight over Berlin involved hundreds of aircraft in a 3-dimensional battle across 50 miles of sky. Captain Gentile shot down 2 Messerschmitts, bringing his total to 12 victories. But he was acutely aware of his fuel gauge. Every minute of combat consumed precious fuel. After 15 minutes, he ordered his squadron to disengage. "We've escorted the bombers in. Time to go home." The flight back was tense. Every pilot monitored fuel consumption. The calculations that looked good on paper were now being tested in reality. They crossed the Dutch coast, with fuel gauges reading dangerously low. As they crossed the English Channel, warning lights illuminated. Captain Gentile landed at Debden with fewer than 15 gallons remaining, barely enough for 5 more minutes of flight. But he made it. They all made it. Every fighter that started the mission returned home safely. The mission returned to England, proving beyond a doubt that external fuel tanks had revolutionized air warfare. No target in Germany was beyond the reach of American fighter escorts. The Luftwaffe's war diary from March 4th recorded the psychological impact. Enemy fighters appeared in strength over Berlin. This development indicates American fighters can now escort bombers anywhere over Reich territory. Previous tactical advantages are negated. This groundbreaking innovation changed the course of the air war. The German Reaction March, 1944, Luftwaffe, High Command, Berlin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was shown intelligence reports on American external fuel tanks. His response was dismissive. This is temporary. These tanks are vulnerable, inefficient. Our pilots will shoot them off their wings. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, disagreed. The tanks work. American fighters now have unlimited range over Germany. They drop the tanks before engaging, so they don't affect combat performance. We must adapt our tactics, but adaptation was difficult. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy had been built on the assumption that American fighters had limited range. German fighters had been positioned to intercept bombers once American escorts turned back. Now, American escorts didn't turn back. German pilots attempted various countermeasures. Some tried to attack American fighters before they could jettison their external tanks, but the Americans quickly discarded them at the first sign of threat. Others tried to avoid combat when American fighters appeared, preserving their strength to attack unescorted bombers. But there were no longer any unescorted bombers. The psychological impact was profound. German fighter pilots, who had dominated European skies for 4 years, suddenly found themselves outranged, outnumbered, and outfought. Luftwaffe ace Lütjens wrote in his diary, "The Americans can go anywhere now. We take off to intercept, burn fuel, reach altitude, engage briefly, then must land to refuel. The Americans stay up for hours. They have fuel to pursue us, to attack our airfields, to hunt us relentlessly. This is not sustainable." The kill ratios reflected this new reality. In March 1944 alone, the 8th Air Force claimed over 500 German fighters destroyed, while losing fewer than 100 American fighters. The production explosion, April 1944. With external fuel tanks proven in combat, production ramped up dramatically. Multiple manufacturers were contracted. North American Aviation's Englewood plant produced tanks for P-51s. Republic Aviation made tanks for P-47s. And Lockheed built tanks for P-38s. By April, combined production exceeded 3,000 external tanks daily, enough to equip every fighter mission with fresh tanks. The design continued to evolve. Early tanks had been relatively crude, but later versions featured improved aerodynamics, better release mechanisms, and standardized attachment points. The 150-gallon paper tank became the standard, called paper because it was made from compressed paper with a plastic coating. Lighter than metal, cheaper to produce, and disposable after a single use, these paper tanks cost $18 each to manufacture. Compared to losing a fighter worth $50,000, they were essentially free. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey, whose crude prototype had started it all, received a promotion to Master Sergeant and a commendation. His citation read, "For innovative thinking and technical excellence in developing the external fuel tank system for fighter aircraft, significantly contributing to Allied air superiority over Europe." But Kelsey remained at his motor pool job, maintaining fighters. When a reporter asked him about his invention, he shrugged. "I just wanted our guys to have enough fuel to do their job. Didn't think it was that big a deal." That not big deal had revolutionized air warfare. The final tally from May 1944 to May 1945. The statistics tell the story of the external fuel tank's impact. Between May 1944 and the end of the war, American fighters flew 137,000 long-range escort missions, nearly all using external fuel tanks. German aircraft production facilities were systematically destroyed. Oil refineries were obliterated. Transportation networks were shattered. All because bombers could reach any target in Germany with fighter protection. Luftwaffe losses were catastrophic. In the final year of the war, Germany lost over 18,000 aircraft, most to American fighters equipped with external fuel tanks. The kill ratio favored the Americans by 6-1, 6 German aircraft destroyed for every American fighter lost. German pilot quality collapsed. Experienced aces were killed faster than replacements could be trained. By late 1944, the average German pilot's training had dropped from 250 hours to just 60 hours. Meanwhile, American pilots, protected by long-range escorts, gained confidence and experience. Aces like Francis Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and George Preddy achieved victory totals that would have been impossible without extended range. The bomber offensive, which had nearly been cancelled after Black Thursday, continued with devastating effectiveness. In the final year of the war, the 8th Air Force dropped over 400,000 tons of bombs on German targets. Without external fuel tanks, none of this would have been possible. The human cost behind these statistics are human stories. Bomber crews that once faced certain death without fighter escort now had protection that allowed them to reach any target in Germany. Every mission that ventured deeper into enemy territory brought the Allies closer to victory, all thanks to one simple but revolutionary idea. Crews who survived missions thanks to fighter protection all the way to their targets and back include Staff Sergeant Joseph Connolly, a B-17 waist gunner who flew 35 missions. He later wrote, "For my first 10 missions, we were on our own after crossing into Germany. German fighters attacked us relentlessly. We lost multiple aircraft every mission. For my last 25 missions, we had fighter escort the entire way. We still encountered Germans, but our fighters drove them off. I probably wouldn't have survived 35 missions without those escorts." The mathematics support his assessment. Before long-range escorts, bomber loss rates averaged 8 to 10% per mission. After long-range escorts became standard, those rates dropped to 2 to 3%. This meant that for every 100 bombers on a mission, 6 to 8 more returned home. Each aircraft carried 10 crew members, so 60 to 80 lives were saved per 100 bombers, over thousands of missions. This translated to tens of thousands of American lives saved. The Luftwaffe paid the price. Experienced German aces, men with hundreds of victories, were shot down by American fighters over their own territory. Major Egon Meyer, credited with developing the head-on attack against B-17s and having downed 102 Allied aircraft, was killed by P-47 fighters over Germany in March 1944. Heinrich Hans Philipp, with 206 victories, was taken down by P-51s in October 1943, just after external tanks entered service. The list of German aces killed by American fighters equipped with external tanks is long. The Luftwaffe's experience and expertise were systematically destroyed. The strategic impact post-war analysis by both American and German military historians consistently identifies external fuel tanks as one of the war's most decisive innovations. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, stated, "The external fuel tank was as important to winning the air war as any weapon system we deployed. It transformed tactical realities and enabled strategic success." Albert Speer, Nazi armaments minister, wrote in his memoir, "The American success in extending fighter range was catastrophic for Germany. Once their fighters could escort bombers anywhere, our defensive strategy collapsed. We could not protect our industry, our cities, or our military." This single innovation arguably shortened the war by months. Reichsmarshal Göring, during post-war interrogation, admitted, I knew we had lost the air war when American fighters appeared over Berlin. Until then, I believed distance protected us. The external fuel tanks eliminated that protection, technological legacy. The implications of this technology extended beyond World War II. Modern aerial refueling, which allows military aircraft to operate globally, directly descends from the external tank concept. Extending aircraft range through additional fuel capacity, whether carried externally or transferred in flight, remains fundamental to air power projection today. The legacy of innovation. The external fuel tank story exemplifies innovation under pressure. When conventional methods failed, an unconventional solution from an unexpected source succeeded. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey wasn't supposed to solve strategic problems. He was a mechanic, but he saw a problem, imagined a solution, and built a prototype. Major James Howard wasn't supposed to authorize unauthorized modifications to aircraft, but he recognized a good idea and supported it despite regulations. General Ira Eaker wasn't supposed to override his engineering staff's objections, but he understood that perfect can be the enemy of good enough, and that good enough now beats perfect later. The external fuel tank succeeded because people at multiple levels were willing to break rules, challenge assumptions, and take risks. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and solutions frequently violate conventional wisdom. Success requires leadership willing to support unconventional ideas. The mechanic's reward master, Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey, remained in the Army Air Force through the end of the war. He received several more commendations for technical innovations, though none as significant as the external fuel tank. After the war, he was offered engineering positions with major aircraft manufacturers, but declined them all. He remained a mechanic because he enjoyed the work. In 1953, Air Force magazine ran a feature story on wartime innovations and interviewed Kelsey about his external fuel tank invention. The reporter asked what motivated him to develop the design. Kelsey's answer was characteristically straightforward. Bomber crews were dying. Fighters couldn't protect them because of fuel range. Seemed like putting more fuel on the plane would solve the problem. So I did. When the reporter pressed, asking, "But you knew the Army had rejected external tanks as impractical. What made you think you could succeed where official engineers failed?" Kelsey smiled and replied, "I didn't know what was impossible because nobody told me it was impossible. If they had, I probably wouldn't have tried. Sometimes not knowing something can't be done is the best way to do it." That quote captures the essence of innovation. Sometimes the people least constrained by conventional wisdom are the ones who solve seemingly impossible problems. Kelsey died in 1987 at age 74. His obituary mentioned his World War II service, but barely referenced the external fuel tank invention. He remained relatively unknown outside aviation history circles, yet every modern military aircraft that uses external tanks, every fighter that can be aerially refueled, owes a debt to the man who saw a problem, thought of a solution, and made it work. Every long-range mission flown by any air force in the world owes something to a motor pool mechanic who looked at a fighter plane and asked, "What if we just strap more fuel to the outside?" The final mission on May 7th, 1945, just one day before the German surrender, Captain Don Gentile, now credited with 30 victories, flew his final combat mission. The target was Prague, Czechoslovakia. The mission profile was routine: escort bombers to the target, engage enemy fighters if present, and return to base. His P-51 Mustang carried two 150-gallon external tanks. Standard equipment, routine procedure. No one even commented on them anymore. But Gentile remembered his first mission to Berlin, the fear of running out of fuel, the constant monitoring of gauges, the relief of landing with fuel to spare. Those external tanks had transformed that anxiety into routine confidence. American fighters could now go anywhere, stay as long as needed, fight when necessary, and always have enough fuel to return home. As he flew over Czechoslovakia, Gentile thought about all the innovations that had won the air war: improved aircraft, better tactics, superior training. But beneath it all, enabling everything else, were those simple aluminum tanks hanging under his wings. Conceived by a mechanic in a maintenance hangar, built from scrap metal and rejected by official engineers as impractical, those tanks had changed history. Gentile landed at Debden for the last time as the war ended. He had survived 58 combat missions, shot down 30 enemy aircraft, and never been forced down by lack of fuel. The external tanks under his Mustang's wings had been just as responsible for his survival as his skill, training, or courage. The enduring lesson, the story of the external fuel tanks, offers lessons that transcend military history. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The best ideas don't always come from research labs or corporate headquarters. Sometimes they come from people doing practical work, directly seeing problems and imagining simple solutions. Bureaucracy can hinder progress. The Army Air Force engineering establishment rejected external tanks based on theoretical objections. They were wrong. A mechanic with no aerodynamics training was right. Leadership matters. General Eaker could have court-martialed Major Howard for unauthorized testing, but instead he overruled his staff and authorized production. That decision saved thousands of lives. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Kelsey's first prototype was crude, but it worked. Waiting for Wright Field to develop a perfect design would have taken months and cost lives. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. The external fuel tank wasn't high-tech. It was a tank strapped to a wing, but it solved a problem that had stumped experts. Relevance beyond military history, these lessons remain relevant today. In any field where innovation matters, the organizations that succeed are those that listen to unconventional voices, support bold ideas, and implement good enough solutions quickly, rather than waiting for a perfect one. The final word, March 4, 1944, above Berlin. Captain Don Gentile completed his mission and turned toward England. His fuel gauges showed enough fuel to make it home. Barely, but enough. Below him, German fighters were burning. Behind him, American bombers completed their bomb runs without fighter interference. Around him, 63 other P-51s prepared for the long flight home. All because one mechanic refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. The external fuel tanks under Gentile's wings weren't elegant. They weren't sophisticated. They were crude aluminum cans with improvised mounting brackets. But they worked. And in war, working is all that matters. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey's crazy idea had doubled bomber range, destroyed the Luftwaffe, and won the air war over Europe. Sometimes, the craziest ideas are the ones that change the world. The mechanic who built the first external fuel tank using scrap metal in a maintenance hangar proved that innovation doesn't require credentials, authority, or official approval. It requires the vision to see solutions others miss, the courage to build despite objections, and the determination to prove that crazy ideas can work. That lesson echoes through history. The next breakthrough, the next innovation that changes everything, might not come from expected sources or follow conventional paths. It might come from a mechanic in a motor pool who looks at an impossible problem and asks, "What if we just try this crazy idea?" And sometimes that crazy idea changes everything.